November 11, 1940. Late evening settles over southern Italy. The harbor at Taranto lies calm, almost ceremonial. Battleships rest at anchor, their silhouettes heavy and immovable against the dark water. Deck lights glow softly. Crews move slowly below, some finishing evening duties, others already asleep in their bunks. The war feels distant here. The harbor is deep, protected, familiar, safe. Above the Adriatic coast, the night air carries a faint mechanical hum. It grows steadily louder, though no one in Taranto hears it yet. There are no alarms. No searchlights probing the sky. Only the quiet confidence of a fleet that believes itself untouchable. Then, far out over the sea, dark shapes descend toward the water aircraft flying low, impossibly low. Canvas wings. Fixed landing gear, obsolete by every modern standard. Yet they come with deliberate purpose, skimming wave tops, navigating by moonlight and memory. Within minutes, the stillness will shatter, steel hulls will burn. The balance of power in the Mediterranean will shift forever. And one assumption shared by navies around the world will quietly die in the dark dot by the autumn of 1940. Europe was already bleeding. Poland had fallen in weeks. France collapsed in 6. Britain stood alone, its army evacuated from Dunkirk, its cities bracing for air raids. The Second World War had entered a brutal new phase, one defined by speed, technology, and the relentless pressure of total war. On June 10, 1940, Benito Mussolini brought Italy into the conflict. The declaration was less a strategic necessity than a political gamble. Mussolini believed the war was nearly won, and that Italy needed only to arrive in time to claim its share of the spoils. But the Italian armed forces were unprepared for a modern industrial war. Equipment was outdated. Coordination between services was weak. And yet, on paper, one arm of Italy's military stood as a formidable exception. The Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, was one of the largest and most modern fleets in Europe. Italy possessed 6 battleships, dozens of cruisers, and a strong force of destroyers and submarines. Its ships were fast, well-armed, and designed for Mediterranean conditions. Italian naval gunnery was respected. Its officers were professional, many trained in pre-war doctrines emphasizing decisive surface engagements. In sheer numbers, the Regia Marina outmatched the British Mediterranean fleet. Geography amplified this advantage. Italy sat astride the central Mediterranean like a fortress. From bases in Taranto, Naples, and Sicily, Italian ships could threaten British supply routes stretching from Gibraltar to Egypt. These sea lanes were lifelines. Through them flowed fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements to British forces defending Malta and the Suez Canal. Lose control of the Mediterranean, and Britain's position in the Middle East would collapse. For the British, the situation was precarious. The Royal Navy was stretched thin across the globe, protecting Atlantic convoys, guarding home waters, and contesting the Mediterranean all at once. At Alexandria, Admiral Andrew Cunningham commanded the Mediterranean fleet with fewer capital ships than his Italian counterpart. Every British loss would be difficult to replace. Every engagement carried strategic risk, yet despite its numerical strength, the Italian fleet rarely sought open battle. Fuel shortages limited operations. Coordination with the Italian Air Force was poor, and Mussolini himself feared risking his prized battleships in a decisive clash. As a result, the Regia Marina adopted a cautious posture, powerful but restrained. It existed as a threat more than as an active weapon, forcing the British to act defensively and dispersing their limited resources. This uneasy balance defined the Mediterranean in mid-1940. Convoys slipped through under constant tension. Naval skirmishes flared and faded. Both sides probed for advantage, but neither delivered a decisive blow. The Italian fleet remained intact, its mere presence shaping British strategy without firing a shot in anger. For British planners, this was unacceptable. As long as the Regia Marina remained whole, Britain would fight the Mediterranean war with one hand tied behind its back. Traditional surface engagements promised heavy losses. Submarine warfare offered limited results. What was needed was a solution that bypassed Italian strength entirely, something asymmetric, unexpected, and decisive, and gradually, attention turned toward a single harbor, Taranto. Taranto was not just a naval base. It was the heart of Italian sea power. Located on the heel of Italy's southern coastline, the harbor sat deep within the Gulf of Taranto, sheltered from rough seas and distant from immediate British airfields. It was divided into two natural basins, the Mar Grande and the Inner Mar Piccolo, connected by narrow channels and protected by layers of coastal defenses. Here, Italy anchored the core of its battle fleet, battleships, cruisers and support vessels resting under the assumption of near-total security. Italian planners believed Taranto was immune to aerial torpedo attack. The water was shallow, barely 40 feet in most places. Conventional wisdom held that torpedoes dropped from aircraft would plunge too deep, striking the harbor floor before stabilizing. This belief was widely shared across global navies, including Britain's. It shaped harbor design, defense planning, and doctrine. Taranto, in this view, was safe by physics alone. Defensive preparations reflected that confidence. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the harbor. Barrage balloons were deployed to deter low-level attacks, though many were absent due to weather damage and logistical shortages. Smoke generators existed but required time to activate. Searchlights and listening posts stood ready, yet they depended on early warning, something Italian radar technology could not yet provide. In theory, Taranto was well defended. In practice, it was complacent. Battleships lay moored close together, their hulls aligned for convenience rather than dispersal. Ammunition was not always fully loaded. Damage control readiness varied by ship. The fleet had conducted drills, but few believed a serious attack was imminent, especially one launched at night from the air against a protected harbor. British intelligence saw opportunity where Italy saw certainty. Aerial reconnaissance flights, often launched from Malta, quietly photographed Taranto over months. Analysts studied anchorage patterns, defensive layouts, and tidal conditions. They noted gaps in balloon coverage. They measured water depth. They watched how ships rotated in and out of harbor. Nothing about Taranto was left to chance. The conceptual roots of an attack stretched back years. As early as 1935. British naval officers had discussed the possibility of a carrier-based strike against a defended port. The idea was controversial. Aircraft were seen as support tools, not decisive weapons. Battleships remained the currency of naval power, yet experiments continued quietly, driven by officers willing to challenge orthodoxy. By 1940, the Mediterranean fleet possessed a crucial asset, the aircraft carrier MS Illustrious. Commissioned only months earlier, Illustrious carried modern naval aircraft and embodied a new doctrine: armored decks, coordinated air operations, and the ability to project power far beyond gun range. Alongside her sailed HMS Eagle, an older carrier but still capable of launching torpedo bombers. Time, however, was working against the British-Italian battleships rotated in and out of Taranto. The fleet's composition changed weekly. Weather windows were narrow, and operational secrecy was paramount. If the Italians detected British intent, the fleet could disperse within hours. The decision, when it came, was calculated and bold: a night attack. From carriers. Using aircraft few believed capable of such a mission. As November approached, British pilots trained intensively, practicing low-altitude navigation and torpedo release. Engineers modified weapons with wooden fins to prevent excessive diving in shallow water. Every detail was refined, tested, and retested. On the evening of November 11, 1940, British carriers turned into the wind. Taranto lay ahead, silent and unprepared. "Shall I proceed tonight aboard the Italian battleships?" followed a familiar rhythm. Below decks, sailors wrote letters, played cards, or slept in narrow bunks stacked 3 high. The heat of southern Italy lingered even after sunset, mixing with oil fumes and the metallic smell of steel hulls. For many, Taranto felt like a reprieve, a pause between convoy escorts and readiness drills. The harbor was home, not a battlefield. Few wore life jackets. Fewer still imagined they would need them. Above them, officers reviewed routine logs. Lookouts scanned the darkness with practiced boredom. Anti-aircraft crews stood down to skeleton shifts. There was no immediate threat. The British were far away. The sea between them felt wide enough to guarantee safety. Approaching Taranto were aircraft that seemed to belong to another era. The ferry Swordfish was a biplane, slow, fabric-covered, and ridiculed by many pilots who flew it. Its maximum speed barely exceeded that of some battleships. Against modern fighters, it was hopeless. Yet it possessed qualities that mattered this night: stability at low speed, reliability, and the ability to fly close to the water without stalling. Its torpedoes had been specially modified. Wooden nose attachments reduced impact shock. Shallow running settings allowed the weapons to level out before hitting the harbor floor. These were not theoretical solutions. They were practical answers to a problem every navy believed unsolvable. Confidence can be a defense or a blindfold. Italian commanders trusted in established naval doctrine. Harbor protection meant guns, depth, and distance. Aircraft were a nuisance, not a strategic threat. Night attacks required precision and coordination that seemed unrealistic, especially from carriers operating hundreds of miles away. British planners thought differently. They believed surprise was a weapon in itself. If the attack succeeded, it would not just damage ships, it would shatter assumptions. The goal was not annihilation, but paralysis. One night of confusion could accomplish what months of surface engagements could not. As the Swordfish crossed the Italian coastline, engines throttled back, wings dark against the moonlit sea, every angle human, technological, psychological converged into a single fragile moment. And Taranto was about to awaken. The British attack plan was deceptively simple: 2 waves, different approach paths, coordinated timing. The first wave would strike to confuse defenses and illuminate targets with flares. The second would exploit the chaos, delivering torpedoes and bombs against already disoriented crews. Aircraft flew in small groups, hugging the water to avoid detection. Navigation relied on moonlight, shoreline landmarks, and stopwatch timing. There would be no second chances. Fuel margins were thin, miss the harbor, and there would be no safe place to land. Torpedo runs were to be executed at dangerously low altitude and speed. Pilots would expose themselves to every gun in the harbor. Escape routes were planned in advance: sharp turns, climbs only after clearing defensive fire, then a long flight back into darkness. At the center of the operation stood Admiral Andrew Cunningham. Cunningham was not reckless, but he understood calculated risk. He trusted his aviators and his intelligence assessments. Most importantly, he believed the Mediterranean War could not be won defensively. If Britain waited, it would slowly bleed itself dry. Below him, Air Group commanders refined details without fanfare. There was no grand speech. No dramatic send-off. The tone was professional, restrained. Success would be measured not in heroics, but in damage inflicted and ships disabled. The decision to proceed rested on judgment sharpened by necessity. Inside Taranto, awareness lagged reality. Italian observers detected aircraft only moments before the first flares fell. Reports moved slowly through command channels. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire piecemeal without centralized coordination. Searchlights swept the sky too late, catching only fragments of movement. Confusion spread faster than information. Some crews believed it was a minor raid. Others assumed British aircraft could not carry torpedoes into the harbor. Orders conflicted. Damage control teams scrambled to stations without clear instructions. In warfare, perception often shapes outcome as much as firepower. By the time the second wave began its approach, Taranto's defenses were firing, but no longer thinking. And the decisive hour had arrived. The first flares ignited the harbor at 22:58. White light cascaded downward, drifting slowly on parachutes, transforming Taranto from a black silhouette into a stark, exposed stage. Battleships emerged in sharp contrast: massive hulls, turret outlines, rigging frozen in sudden clarity. For the first time that night, Italian sailors understood this was no routine alarm. Almost immediately, the air filled with fire. Anti-aircraft guns opened from shore batteries, destroyers, and capital ships. Tracers stitched erratic patterns across the sky, bright and desperate. The sound rolled through the harbor in waves: heavy caliber thumps from naval guns, rapid chatter from machine cannons, the echo rebounding off water and steel. Then the torpedo bombers arrived, flying scarcely above mast height. Swordfish aircraft lined up on their runs. Pilots held their course with deliberate calm, throttles steady, eyes fixed on targets illuminated by flare light and burning fuel tanks already struck by bombs. The first torpedo entered the water cleanly. Moments later, It struck the battleship Conte Cavour amidships. The explosion tore open her hull below the waterline. Seawater rushed in, uncontrollable. Within minutes, the ship began to list heavily, settling into the shallow harbor bottom. Another swordfish released its weapon toward Littorio, Italy's newest and most powerful battleship. The torpedo detonated beneath her forward hull, sending a column of water and debris skyward. Fires broke out on deck. Emergency crews rushed to seal compartments, but flooding spread rapidly. Bombs followed torpedoes. High-explosive and incendiary bombs struck hangars, fuel stores, and dock installations. One hit ignited an oil tank near the shoreline, bathing parts of the harbor in orange flame. Smoke thickened, reducing visibility and choking crews as they fought fires with hoses and buckets. Italian gunners fired continuously now. Some swordfish were hit. One aircraft spiraled down, crashing into the harbor. Another limped away trailing smoke, barely airborne. But the slow biplanes proved unexpectedly difficult targets, too slow for lead calculations trained on faster aircraft, too low for comfort. Within 20 minutes, the first wave withdrew. Behind them, Taranto burned. Battleships sat crippled at anchor. Fires spread unchecked. Command posts struggled to assess damage amid broken communications. The harbor, once a symbol of security, had become a trap. And even as Italian crews fought desperately to save their ships, new engine sounds approached from the sea. The second wave was coming. Shortly after 23:30, the second wave entered the harbor. By now, Taranto was no longer dark. Flames from burning fuel tanks reflected off the water, casting flickering light across hulls and gun barrels. Smoke drifted unevenly, creating pockets of shadow and sudden visibility. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, but coordination remained fractured. Guns fired independently, often masking one another's fields of view. The swordfish pilots flew into a world already breaking apart. Some targets were obscured. Others were newly exposed. Crews adjusted on instinct, selecting battleships still afloat, aiming for areas already weakened by earlier hits. Torpedoes dropped in quick succession, slicing into the water with shallow splashes before racing toward steel hulls. Littorio was struck again, this time aft. The explosion crippled her steering, flooding multiple compartments. Damage control teams fought relentlessly, counter-flooding to prevent capsizing. The battleship survived, but she was effectively removed from combat. Nearby, Caio de Uaio took a torpedo hit near the bow. Water surged through the forward compartments. The ship's captain ordered her run aground to prevent sinking, embedding the bow in the harbor floor while the stern remained afloat. Bombs continued to fall across the port. Aircraft hangars burned. Dock cranes twisted and collapsed. Smaller vessels were damaged or destroyed outright. The harbor echoed with shouted orders, steam venting from ruptured pipes, the hiss of fire hoses, and the groan of stressed metal. Italian fighters never arrived. By the time airfields were alerted and aircraft prepared, the attackers were already withdrawing. The swordfish climbed slowly away from Taranto, disappearing into the night over the Ionian Sea. Their return flight was long and tense, engines running low on fuel, pilots navigating by starlight and instinct. At dawn, the full scale of the disaster became visible. 3 Italian battleships lay sunk or crippled in shallow water. Hundreds of sailors were dead or wounded. The pride of the Regia Marina sat broken without having fired a single shot at the enemy fleet. For Britain, losses were minimal. 2 aircraft destroyed, a handful of aircrew lost. The imbalance was staggering, yet the true impact went beyond tonnage and casualty figures. In a single night, the concept of harbor invulnerability had been exposed as a dangerous illusion, and the consequences would ripple far beyond Taranto. The morning of November 12th revealed a transformed harbor where orderly lines of battleships once rested. There were now shattered silhouettes and oil-slicked water. Salvage crews moved cautiously among wreckage and debris. Smoke still rose from damaged facilities. The smell of fuel and burned paint hung heavy in the air. Italian Naval Command began its assessments immediately, and the conclusions were grim. The battleship Conte Cavour was effectively lost. Though efforts were made to refloat her, she would never return to active service. Littorio and Caio de Uaio survived, but both required extensive repairs. For months, they would be confined to dockyards, unable to influence the war at sea. In practical terms, half of Italy's operational battleship force had been neutralized in a single night. The psychological impact was even greater. Taranto had been considered the safest anchorage in the Mediterranean. Its defenses were textbook examples of interwar naval thinking. Yet none of that mattered against a weapon many still regarded as auxiliary. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. If Taranto was vulnerable, then no harbor was truly safe. Italian naval operations slowed immediately. Capital ships were dispersed or moved to more distant ports. Sorties became rarer. Escort missions were conducted with greater caution. The Regia Marina still existed, but it no longer exerted the same pressure simply by being present. For the British, the results were strategic and immediate. Convoy routes became less contested. The Mediterranean fleet gained operational freedom it had not possessed since Italy entered the war. Malta, still under siege, benefited from improved supply flows. Admiral Cunningham described the attack as the most devastating blow yet struck against the enemy fleet. International observers took notice. Naval attaches requested reports. Analysts studied photographs. Technical details, torpedo modifications, attack altitudes, timing were scrutinized quietly in foreign capitals. Some dismissed the raid as a one-off gamble. Others saw something more fundamental, a shift in naval warfare. Yet, in the broader chaos of 1940, Taranto did not dominate headlines for long. London faced the Blitz. North Africa erupted into maneuver warfare. Attention moved quickly, as it often does in war, but beneath the surface, assumptions had cracked. The idea that battleships could rest safely at anchor, protected by depth and guns alone, was no longer credible. Taranto had proven that air power, when used with precision and daring, could reach anywhere, and this realization would not remain confined to the Mediterranean. The lessons of Taranto traveled quietly, but they traveled far, within weeks. Naval staffs across the world requested detailed intelligence summaries, diagrams of the harbor, torpedo trajectories, aircraft loadouts. The British did not publicize the technical specifics, but enough information circulated through diplomatic and intelligence channels to make the implications impossible to ignore. Among the most attentive observers were officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Japanese naval attaches in Europe analyzed Taranto with professional intensity. They noted the shallow water, the modified torpedoes, the timing of the attack. To them, Taranto was not an anomaly, it was confirmation. Confirmation that air power could cripple a fleet at anchor. Confirmation that battleships, however powerful, were vulnerable when stationary. Confirmation that surprise, planning, and aviation could rewrite naval doctrine overnight. In the Mediterranean, the balance of power had already shifted. Italian naval commanders adopted a more defensive posture. Battleships were kept dispersed. Ports were reinforced with additional anti-aircraft guns and nets. Barrage balloons increased. Yet these measures addressed symptoms, not the underlying truth revealed by Taranto. The age of uncontested capital ship dominance was ending. British operations expanded with renewed confidence. Convoys ran with greater frequency. Naval forces operated closer to contested waters. The Mediterranean fleet, once constrained by caution, gained operational initiative. Though the war would continue to exact a heavy toll, Taranto marked the moment when Britain stopped merely surviving in the Mediterranean and began shaping events, and still the raid faded from popular memory. It lacked the scale of later battles. There were no massed fleets clashing in daylight, no towering casualty figures. No immediate surrender followed. Taranto was subtle in its devastation, measured not in spectacle, but in altered behavior and broken assumptions. Yet, its influence echoed unmistakably. Just 13 months later, another fleet would lie at anchor, confident in distance and defense. Another nation would believe shallow water offered protection. Another surprise would arrive from the sky, rewriting history on a far greater scale. Taranto was not an ending. It was a warning about the future of warfare, about the fragility of power, and about the danger of believing yesterday's rules still applied. And that warning leads inevitably to reflection. Taranto was quiet in the record books, yet thunderous in its implications. A single night had unmade illusions. Battleships, symbols of naval might, could be felled without a fleet clash. Doctrine, confidence, and complacency had collided with innovation, courage, and precision. The war did not pause to honor this moment, but it reshaped the rules quietly, irrevocably. In hindsight, the attack stands as a testament to the evolving nature of warfare. Technology alone does not dictate victory. Creativity, planning, and audacity do. The swordfish derided, obsolete, almost laughable, had delivered what modern steel and firepower could not. The human element, disciplined and fearless, remained decisive, yet there is also a somber lesson. Taranto cost lives. Hundreds of sailors perished or were wounded. Ships that had once represented national pride sank or burned. Victory here was silent, invisible to the public eye, but no less real. History often remembers grand battles and famous generals, but some of the most consequential moments are measured in recalculated assumptions, fractured confidence, and the quiet, enduring fear of what might strike next. For modern military thought, Taranto endures as both caution and inspiration, a reminder that no fortress is impregnable, no strategy unassailable, and that even in darkness, innovation can illuminate the path to decisive change. The night of November 11th to 12th, 1940 may be forgotten by many, but the echoes of its torpedoes continue to ripple through history, shaping naval warfare for generations to come.